Want to give this a go now. And see KK there. How you doing? And hopefully everyone will be able to hear. Keep in mind, if you do have something to say, and I'm not discouraging that at all. Just go ahead and unmute your line, and we definitely want to hear any comments or feedback, or especially questions that you may have. All right, so where are we? We are in Exodus chapter 8, and we are looking at this story, this circumstance between the instructions that have been given to Moses and the obstacles that he now is facing, while attempting and actually doing what God has asked him to do. And one of the things that we're trying to do with the story is make sure that we're able to utilize it from a personal standpoint. Does the story relate to you? And that's important about everything in the Bible. If the Bible doesn't relate to you, then why even deal with it? It's important that you're able to pull from it some things that you can say, wow, you know what? I see how this person learned to lean on God, trust God in these types of situations. I feel I can do similar. And that's the goal, to build your relationship. You know God as God, but can you know him as the God of the Bible? Can these stories reflect things in your own situation? We also look at these stories in relationship to the nations. We're going to see God telling Moses that the nation that they're in, that they are now servitude to, God has seen how they have treated them and is coming now to deal with it. And we've raised the question, well, why didn't God deal with it from the very beginning? And we tried to make sure that we understood that God is not only dealing with us and with me and with you, but he's dealing with other people too, other nations. And he even said prior to this that the nations that are in the land that they're going to, he said, I can't move you there yet to that promised land because they are still under the test or the trial. In other words, the actual phraseology was the indignation for those nations is not full yet. So they haven't reached their limit. But now God is saying, these nations have reached their limit. I'm going to move you from the nation that you are in, because it's reached its limit, and move you to the land where the other nations are, because they've reached their limit. Point this out. God is pointing this out, that there are things that God will allow until a certain point. And then God says, okay, I'm coming in now and I'm going to deal with this because I gave you plenty of what? Time to get things together. You seen me, you watched me, and you still chose to go your own way. We can even draw a clear and very precise example from the nation that they're in, and that's the nation of Egypt. When Joseph was there, how God dealt with not first Joseph, but he dealt first with the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, and gave him a dream, and then used Joseph to help Pharaoh interpret the dream to save the nation that God had given to him. So God used the dream that he gave to Pharaoh to save Egypt, and that was over 400 years ago. But Egypt still, once they realized that God is a God that can control and can save and can deliver, they still chose to follow their own God. So they went their own way. They followed their own heart. That nation followed their own cultural ways, even though prior to that, during that, they recognized that God was the God of all. And they still chose to serve the multiple gods and ignored the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that was revealed to them through Joseph. So now Moses is talking and he's sharing with Pharaoh. He's going back, and then it's not happening the way he thinks it's supposed to happen. And now Moses goes to God and says, it's not happening. So he's going back to God, which is one of the things that we tried to point out. When things are not going well, when you're doing what God is calling you to do, that doesn't mean that God is still not involved. He's still there. And God told Moses, this is what was supposed to happen. Pharaoh's heart was going to get hard, and he was going to deny the request that God, told you to tell him. And God then says, I'm going to send you back. And so that's kind of like where we are. That's the background of kind of like what we've covered so far in these last 7 weeks. So let's go ahead and get into our next chapter, chapter 8. Let's follow the reading. And once again, I'm hoping that everyone will have no problem hearing this. Let's take a listen. Chapter 8.
Chapter 8. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Go unto Pharaoh, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. And if thou refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all thy borders with frogs. And the river shall bring forth frogs abundantly, which shall go up and come into thine house, and into thy bedchamber, and upon thy bed, and into the house of thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thine ovens, and into thy kneading troughs. And the frog shall come up both on thee, and upon thy people, and upon thy servants. And the Lord spake unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Stretch forth thine hand with thy rod over the streams, over the rivers, and over the ponds, and cause frogs to come up upon the land of Egypt. And Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up, and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments, and brought up frogs upon the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron, and said,
Entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me, and from my people, and I will let the people go, that they may do sacrifice unto the Lord.
And Moses said unto Pharaoh,
Glory over me. When shall I entreat for thee, and for thy servants, and for thy people, to destroy the frogs from me and thy houses, that they may remain in the river only?
And he said,
Tomorrow.
And he said,
Be it according to thy word, that thou mayest know that there is none like unto the Lord our God. And the frogs shall depart from thee, and from thy houses, and from thy servants, and from thy people. They shall remain in the river only.
And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and the frogs died out of the houses, out of the villages, and out of the fields. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he hardened his heart, and hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And the Lord said unto Moses, Say unto Aaron, Stretch out thy rod, and smite the dust of the land, that it may become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so, for Aaron stretched out his hand with his rod, and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and in beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And the magicians did so with their enchantments, to bring forth lice, but they could not. So there were lice upon man and upon beast. Then the magician said unto Pharaoh, This is the finger of God. And Pharaoh's heart was hardened, and he hearkened not unto them, as the Lord had said. And the Lord said unto Moses, Rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water, and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Let my people go, that they may serve me. Else if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send swarms of flies upon thee, and upon thy servants, and upon thy people, and into thy houses. And the houses of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereon they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarms of flies shall be there. To the end thou mayest know that I am the Lord in the midst of the earth. And I will put a division between my people and thy people. Tomorrow shall this sign be. And the Lord did so, and there came a grievous swarm of flies into the house of Pharaoh, and into his servants' houses, and into all the land of Egypt. The land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron, and said,
Go ye, sacrifice to your God in the land.
And Moses said,
It is not meet so to do, for we shall sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. Lo, shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes? And will they not stone us? We will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness, and sacrifice to the Lord our God, as he shall command us.
And Pharaoh said,
I will let you go, that ye may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness. Only ye shall not go very far away. Entreat for me.
And Moses said,
Behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarms of flies may depart from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people tomorrow. But let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully any more in not letting the people go to sacrifice to the Lord.
And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses, and he removed the swarms of flies from Pharaoh, from his servants, and from his people. There remained not one. And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go.
All right, there we go with that story. Now, chapter 8 is, number one, it's a long chapter, has a lot in it. And I'm going to look at it more so. Oh, I see Michelle Coleman coming in. There she goes. I'm going to look at chapter 8 more so as a overview, because a lot of this is repetitive. All right. So what I mean by that is that we're going to see very similar things, but there are a few things that I am going to point out concerning this chapter that I think it's important to keep in mind. Now, if you remember on last week when Moses went to the river and he touched the river Nile, and the Nile turned to blood, and he told them that this was a sign from God that this thing that I'm asking you to do is not for me, and it's not something that I desire. It's not something that's just in my heart. It's something that God is telling you that you need to do. And Pharaoh didn't want to do it. And then Pharaoh also then decided to compare his spiritual beliefs to the spiritual beliefs of what Moses had. In other words, your God said turn the water into blood. Well, he called his magicians and his enchanters, and they did what? They did the same thing. So then, and from his mind, it was like, okay, no big deal. However, one of the things that we pointed out on last week was that they still needed God to change it what? Back. To get things back to normal. Only God could do that. The enchanters and the magicians of Egypt couldn't. So, once again, we see this going on again. And when it says in chapter 8, it says, And the Lord spoke unto Moses, Go down unto Pharaoh and say unto him, Thus saith the Lord, let my people go. All right? And he says, and if they refuse to let my people go, I will smite the borders with frogs. Now, here we go with this frog thing. And what we're going to see here is these frogs, and then we're going to see that the magicians are going to be able to do the same thing. And keep this in mind. These frogs were an idol to the Egyptians. It was part of their god pantheon of gods. Frogs, bugs, cats, oxen, all types of animals they worship. We're going to see when the Lord does bring them out eventually that culture of worshiping the strength and the peculiarness of animals will follow them. All right. So when they get out and they get out to the mountain, they're going to create their own little god of gold in the form of a bull. But right now, God is dealing with all of these different animals, and he's pointing out that these gods that you serve are not as great as me. So he says, I'm going to give you what you want. You want to serve the Nile? Well, I'll turn the Nile into blood. You want to serve frogs? Well, I'm going to give you all the frogs you want. And you're going to see how valuable or invaluable these frogs actually are. All right? So, it says that when he went down to the down to the river, that there shall be frogs abundantly. This is verse 3. And it shall go up and come into thy houses and into thy bedchambers. Frogs in the bed with you. All right? And upon your bed, they're going to be in your servant's house, and upon all the people, in thy oven, and in thy kneading trough. So the frogs are going to be everywhere. Everywhere you turn, you're going to have frogs. All right? So what he did was, see, the God that we serve is a God that's where? Our God is where? Everywhere. So he says, I'm going to make your God that you're serving like me. All right? I'm everywhere. So you serving frogs, so I'm going to let your gods be what? Everywhere too. I find it kind of comical that God is utilizing that he's trying to show that your gods cannot be and do what I do. All right? And so in verse 5 it says, in the Lord's let me see here. Yes, verse 5. And it says, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying unto Aaron, stretch forth your hand and thy rod over the streams and over the rivers and over the ponds, and cause the frogs to come down upon the land of Egypt. And that's what happened. Verse 6, and Aaron stretched out of his hand upon the water of Egypt, and frogs came and covered the land of Egypt. And the magicians, in verse 7, did so with what? Their enchantments. What are these enchantments that they are doing? Who are they calling on? What power are they pulling from? Is this some magician's trick? Or are they actually trying to connect in the spiritual realm to the enemy? Are they touching the limited spiritual power in comparison to God that Satan has? And I would not doubt that. It doesn't give us specific whether these magicians had any type of trickery or whether they had actual occult power. I don't know. I wasn't there. My opinion is that they had some kind of occult power because Satan desires to be worshipped and he desires to show forth his little limited ability. So if Satan can impress you to worship him, by him showing you some of the little things he can do in the spiritual realm, he will do it. But keep this in mind. In doing that, you'll find yourself in some serious bondage. One of the things that you don't want to do is to allow yourself to get to a place where you have no way of return. The scripture calls that having your mind seared, and you're no longer able to hear, and you have what's called a reprobate mind, and you're no longer able to recognize that God is trying to pull you back. You don't have the hurt of disappointment of not following God that you may have had in the past.
Hardened heart.
You have a hardened heart, exactly. And that's exactly what Pharaoh has here. All right. So those magicians, when they did that, that kind of let them feel a little bit like, okay, we're doing the same thing. What's the big difference between the God that we serve and this God that Moses is presenting to us? Well, there is a big difference. And it's important for us to keep that in mind because we see that today in our world. People want to know, well, why should I serve your God, the God of the Bible? What difference does he have between the God of any other religious group? And the thing to keep in mind is that God will always show himself in time and at the right circumstance, the right situation. He will speak to you individually, but he will at some point do with our nation like he's doing with this nation. Well, he will just show himself. The scripture always talks about the windows of heaven being open. And when the windows of heaven being open, that typifies that you no longer have to guess at spiritual things. Those spiritual things are revealed and opened to you obviously. Jesus said that when someone says, well, Jesus is here, he's down in the mountain, or he's down in the desert, or he's down, in the secret chambers, Jesus said, believe them not. He said, for the coming of the man will be as the lightning going across the sky. When lightning goes across the sky, everybody that wants to see it can see it. And so that's an important thing to keep in mind when it comes down to God's dealing with individuals, you, me, or dealing with a nation. You will recognize that, wow, I think God's trying to get my attention. And it won't really be a lot of a mystery unless you refuse to believe that God wants to talk to you and harden your heart. All right. So in verse 8, it says, then Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and entreated the Lord and said, entreat the Lord that he may take away the frogs from me. Now, keep it in mind, once again, the magicians were able to replicate by bringing up frogs at a command, but they couldn't get rid of them. So that once again, this is how we know this is God. But they're going to get to that point as well. Skipping down to verse 9, it says, and Moses said unto Pharaoh, glory over me, when shall I entreat for thee, thy servant, and for thy people, to destroy the frogs from thee, and from thy house, and from the river? And then Pharaoh says in verse 10, he says, tomorrow. All right. Now, this is important too. We want to kind of pause here for a second. Because what Moses is pointing out to Pharaoh is that God will still hear you if you speak to him. So Moses is saying, okay, God can get rid of the frogs. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we can move the frogs out. But I want to hear from you, Pharaoh. When do you want the frogs to go? Because I don't want you to come back and say, well, it just happened by chance, or say, well, maybe eventually my magicians were able to do it. You tell me when you want God, our God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to remove the frogs. And then that's when they will go. It's an important thing to keep in mind that you can be as far out as where Pharaoh is. And if you try to get back to God, he will allow you to get there. Now, if you notice in these first couple of times, it's stated that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. We're going to see a change here in a minute, because what God is doing, he says, what I've done was I've given you what you wanted. I locked you in for a period of time and gave you what you wanted. Your gods, the Nile, the frogs. But you're going to start seeing here in these next couple of times that it's not going to say that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. It's going to say Pharaoh hardened his own heart. That meant that Pharaoh had another opportunity, and he didn't take it. All right. So look at verse 11. It says, and the frogs shall depart from thee, and from thy house, and from thy servant, and from thy people, and they shall remain in the river only. And Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, and Moses cried unto the Lord because of the frogs which he had brought against Pharaoh. And the Lord did according to the word of Moses. So Moses told God exactly what Pharaoh wanted, for the frogs to leave the next day. It says, and the frogs died out of the house, and out of the villages, and out of the fields. And they gathered them together upon heaps, and the land stank. Now, here we go with another situation where we saw this previously. When the river was having its problem and it turned to blood, there was a bad smell. All right, and so now we see this again, where the answer came. The problem was the frogs everywhere. Now the frogs are dead. But now you got extra work. So you still now have a burden to deal with because you didn't listen. The initial issue is gone, but now you got to still handle and deal with the repercussions and the backlash of the problem. And that is, you still got to get the dead frogs up. There's still a bad odor. There's a lingering effect on your decision to serve and to worship these idols that you still have to deal with. We can bring it to our own lives, and sometimes the Lord will speak to us, and we'll say certain things, and we'll say, okay, well, Lord, I want to make this change. And then you'll see a change happen, and you'll see some deliverance, but you still now have a lasting issue that you got to still handle and deal with. And that's what's happening here with this land of Egypt. When we look at verse 15, this is an important part here, because this is what I was talking about with Pharaoh. So now they done cleaned up the frogs, they done gathered them up, they got them all burnt up in the heat. Verse 15, look at this. But when Pharaoh saw that there was respite, he harden his heart and hearken not unto them. See, the key here when you look at this, and like I said, previous to this, you saw it said that God hardened Pharaoh's heart because God had him locked in. But now we're at a point where God was saying, okay, you entreated me to take the frogs out on the next day, and I did. So you came to me with a request, and I listened. I'm unlocking your heart. I want to see what you're going to do with it now. Are you going to move, or are you going to do what I've already assigned you to do previously, which was, I know that you didn't want to serve me, so I didn't come unto you. Remember, we can't come to God unless God, what, draws us. Here's another opportunity. Pharaoh has his own free will here. And in verse 15, it says that he hardened his heart and hearkened not unto them as the Lord had said. And you say, well, God already knew. That's why the Lord allowed his heart to remain hardened the first couple of times. But then God intervened. Now, you can say, well, is that kind of a miracle that God broke up Pharaoh's hard heart? Even though Pharaoh may not have turned to God, but yet God is saying, I'm going to let your heart be softened one more time. From all these years that you've hardened your heart against me, just so you can maybe feel my spirit, my anointing one more time, and let you choose. And to me, it's this verse 15 is deeper than I think I can actually explain it. It's almost like God is saying, here's your last chance, but I need you to make a decision. And Pharaoh hardened his heart himself. And we're going to see that a couple of times here again. This isn't the only time he's going to do that. And the reason why I'm kind of harping on this, and I don't know, because what we're looking at is how our spiritual person is. So you could look at me and you could say, well, okay, I can see your natural person. I can see you got glasses on, so you probably need some help seeing. I can see you got a little gray beard, or you probably, got a little age on you. You can look at me and just see certain things from the natural. You see you ain't got too much hair on the top, so you either, you got something going on up there that they ain't producing hair. All that stuff you can derive just from looking at the natural. But what you don't see is the spiritual. And if you could see the condition of a person's spiritual, some people's spiritual being is just broken up. It's hurt. It's crippled. It's deformed in certain ways, and you can tell they're not doing very well. Some people's spiritual being is dead. All right? But just like God, just like through Jesus, the Lord showed us that the natural man can be what? Resurrected. How many people did Jesus raise from the dead? We're going to see as we go through the Old Testament, different ones that are raised from the dead. How much more so our spiritual being? This was an opportunity, from what I can see here, trying to see it from the spiritual side, that this Pharaoh, whose spiritual man is more than likely dead, an opportunity for it to be risen. But that did not happen.
It's also showing God's love.
It's showing God's love, exactly as Penny said. Another opportunity. But Pharaoh did not take advantage of it. He allowed himself to stay with what he was used to and what he was comfortable with and what he knew. And that was, I'm serving these gods of the Egyptian culture. They're the gods I lean on and trust on. Although I still have to ask the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to give me some relief from the issues and the problems that I face day to day. But when it comes down to me worshiping, I'm worshiping the gods of the Egyptians. That's what I'm going to do. And sometimes, unfortunately, that seems to be the problem with a lot of people. They have an ideology and a philosophy and a way that they just want to worship it, and they won't turn from that. They will continue to be connected to that old cultural way and find themselves not moving forward in building a relationship with God. All right. Verse 16. And the Lord said unto Moses, say unto Aaron, stretch forth thy rod and smite the dust of the land, that it might become lice throughout all the land of Egypt. And they did so, and Aaron stretched forth his hand with the rod, this is verse 17, and smote the dust of the earth, and it became lice in man and beast. All the dust of the land became lice throughout all the land of Egypt. Now we're going to pause there for a moment. Okay, that's a major problem now, because see, the water of the river, it was a problem, but the problem was in the water. The frogs were a problem because they were, in the ovens and in the beds, but they were not. They were, and in the river and on the land. But the difference with the lice is now on you. You see, so now the problem is in me. I got it on my body. I got it in my head. I got it in my, the lice is now attacking itself to me. And so when we look at this with the lice, and we're going to see this again going forward. Look at verse 18. And the magicians did so with their enchantments to bring forth lice, but they could not. All right, so they tried to do it. They said, well, we serve these bugs too. We know how to worship bugs. So we're going to do our little bug enchantment. We're going to call on our bug God and see if he can do his thing. But it didn't happen. So either by some trickery or by them calling on the spiritual limited power that Satan has, this was not able to be duplicated. They couldn't do it. So therefore, they said in verse 19, then the magicians said unto Pharaoh. Now this is Pharaoh's, religious leaders, Pharaoh's pastor, so to speak, said unto them, this is the finger of God. So now Pharaoh is now getting spiritual advice from his spiritual leaders of his nation to tell him the thing that we're dealing with is not an ordinary thing. This is actually God that we're dealing with. God will say, well, Pharaoh probably said, well, I serve all gods. No, and they're saying, no, this is a different kind of God. This is a God that's doing stuff that we can't duplicate and we can't explain. And that's the beauty of it, because see, a lot of times we like to take God that we serve and we want to put him in a test tube. We want to be able to have God answer all our questions and have God equal to some kind of equation and make mathematical sense out of God, which will never really happen. That God will never allow himself to be examined to the point where he can be highly predictable, repeatable, and explainable. God will always be a mystery to us. All right. So, but now look at Pharaoh. It says, and Pharaoh's heart was what? Hardened, and he hearkened not unto them as the Lord had said. So Pharaoh's heart was hardened again, and he did not listen. Well, once again, before God even sent Moses out the very first time, he told Moses, Pharaoh's not going to listen to it. No matter what I do with Pharaoh, whether I leave him where he is, whether I remove his own hard heart wall that he built, if I knock that down, he's going to do what? Build it right back up again. And that's exactly what Pharaoh did. All right. Verse 20. And the Lord said unto Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth the water, and say unto him, thus saith the Lord, let my people go, and so they may serve me. Verse 21. Else if thou wilt not let my people go, behold, I will send a swarm of what? Flies. All right. Now here we go again. Another what? Another bug. Another entity that this culture serve. And it's interesting because the flies is a god that the Egyptians serve that is sometimes related directly to Satan. Satan is often called the Lord of Flies. So it's almost like a situation there where it's like, I'm going to hit your the guy that you guys are serving, and y'all don't even know who he is. You think he's just a god, because they're trying to worship gods because they want to serve the god of the Nile, because the Nile brings water and fertilizes and waters our crops. And you serve these frogs because these frogs can do a variety of things. Plus they can be used for food and variety of different things. And a lot of things that you can't explain, you just look at it and say, well, because it's a mystery, I worship it. But all of this relates back to the Lord of Flies, who this Bible actually describes as being Satan. So I just find that interesting that right now they're dealing with these flies. All right, and once again, the same thing. The flies are going to be in the house of every Egyptian, and they're going to be swarms. All right, and look at verse 22. And I will serve in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, that no swarm of flies shall be there. Now, so here's the difference. All the other situations happen. It seems as though everybody was affected. Now God is making a what? A separation. The thing that's happening in this nation and in Egypt will be happening only to people that don't believe in me. It will not happen in the land of Goshen where the Hebrews were. So now God is drawing a separation, and that's something to keep in mind as well. Is that God oftentimes will bring us in the fire, but bring us through. We talk about the Hebrew boys. But what's happening here is that God is saying, this time, when the plague comes, the flies are going to be in Egypt, but they will not be in Goshen. In other words, God's people will not be affected. The flies exist, but they're not affecting them. And that's something to keep in mind as well when we're dealing with our issues. A lot of times you wonder, well, why does this stuff happen to me and not to others? All right. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind. All right. Just trying to look at my time here. And I'm going to try to see if it's possible for me to finish up, and I might be able to. So let's go ahead and take a look at verse 24. It says, and the Lord did so, and there came grievous swarms of flies upon the house of Pharaoh, and unto his servants' house, and into all the land of Egypt. And the land was corrupted by reason of the swarm of flies. Look at verse 25 though. And Pharaoh called for Moses and for Aaron, and said, go ye sacrifice to your God in the land. Now, this is important because this is kind of like, once again, what happens with us. We've gotten to the point where, okay, we had the plagues, and they kind of went to a certain progression. Then we got to the lice where the stuff was actually on us. Then we got to the flies where it's like, okay, I can see there's a difference. Certain people are getting it and other people are not. And you're kind of breaking down now. But you're not truly giving in to God. Pharaoh's heart is still hard, but he's also thinking rationally. He's like, I got an issue here. So I don't really want to serve God. I'm looking for a compromise. So look at what Pharaoh says. He says, and Pharaoh called for Moses and Aaron and said, go ye and sacrifice to your God. Not to the God, to what? Your God in the land. So he's saying, do what you need to do. Go ahead and serve your God, because Pharaoh is saying, I'm not serving him. And go do what you need to do with your God, but don't go far. Stay in the land. Stay right here. In other words, stay in the area that is corrupted with all the false gods, and just serve your God in the midst of all of this. And that's not going to work. Look at verse 26. And Moses said, it is not meet to do so, for we will sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians to the Lord our God. Lo, we shall we sacrifice the abomination of the Egyptians before their eyes? And will they not stone us? So what they're saying is, when we start sacrificing, we're gonna sacrifice animals. And some Egyptians, there's gonna be some Egyptians somewhere that animal that we sacrifice happens to be their god, or their god of the day, or their god of the week, or their god of the month. And they're gonna want to kill us because we're sacrificing, our the things that we sacrifice to our God. Going all the way back to the very first sacrifice. Remember when God killed they slain the animal and covered Adam and Eve with the coats of skin. And so that whole concept of sacrificing, and so what Moses is saying, we're not going to try to serve God in your cultural ways, because your cultural ways don't fit what we do. You're going to get offended. And man, does that happen today. When people try to do the things that God asks them to do in an area, in a land, in a nation, in a mindset where people are trying to still hold on to their gods, people get offended. They get mad. They start calling you all kinds of names because all you're doing is trying to worship God in the way He tells you to worship. And the people in your culture is like, you think you're better than us, or you think you're superior, or they're going to call you all kinds of names because you refuse to acknowledge their God in the worshiping of your God. See, I can't acknowledge the cultural ways of our society that are against God when I worship my God, because that's not worshiping my God. I have to worship Him as He truly is. And so what Moses is pointing out is that no, I can't do that. I can't worship here because you guys are going to get offended when y'all see what our God considers to be something that's worth sacrificing. So the thing that I'm going to sacrifice, that's something that y'all worship. The things I'm going to get rid of and clean myself from, that's the stuff that y'all want to lift up. And God is saying through Moses, that's not the way to go. All right. Let's finish this up here. Verse 27. It says, we will go 3 days' journey into the wilderness and sacrifice to the Lord our God, and He shall, as He shall command us. Verse 28. This is important. And Pharaoh said, I will let you go, that you may sacrifice to the Lord your God in the wilderness, only ye shall not go very far. Entreat for me. So now Pharaoh's offering another compromise. And keep this in mind. What Pharaoh is doing is what a lot of people do. They're trying to find a way that I can serve this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and still hold on to my Egyptian philosophy. I can still hold on to my own personal philosophy. I can still hold on to my cultural thinking. I can still, kind of mix it all together. So I'm not going to, I'll let you go, but I'm not going to let you go but so far. He says you will not go very far away. So in other words, I can kind of run to this one. I got enough time to go and do this for a little bit, and I'm close enough to where I can go back. So I can kind of run between the two. But the scripture tells us that we can't serve what? Two gods. Mm-hmm. You're going to love one or hate the other. So once again, you got to make the choice. And this is not what God allows, and Moses doesn't agree with this either. Look at verse 29. And Moses said, behold, I go out from thee, and I will entreat the Lord that the swarm of flies may depart from Pharaoh and from his servants and from the people tomorrow. But let not Pharaoh deal deceitfully anymore in letting the people go to sacrifice for the Lord. And Moses went out from Pharaoh and entreated the Lord, and the Lord did according to the word of Moses. And he removed the swarm of flies from Pharaoh and from his servants and from his people, and there remained not one. But look at verse 32. And Pharaoh hardened his heart at this time also, neither would he let the people go. Verse 32, once again, is another area in here where you will see where it says that Pharaoh hardened his heart. So that's an important thing to keep in mind, that God is giving Pharaoh an opportunity. Pharaoh, you've built all this stuff up by accepting your cultural ways. You accepted the Egyptian way. I'm coming in doing stuff to you that's knocking down the wall that you built to separate yourself from me. That's God. You know, when you look in the book of Revelation in the Laodicean church, where it says that Jesus is on the outside of the door doing what? Knocking. Trying to do what? Trying to get in. Well, this is right here is another example of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob standing behind the wall that the Egyptian culture and Pharaoh have built, and God is knocking that wall down. And every time God knocks it down, peeps in and says, you know, here I am, Pharaoh builds up another wall. He talks like he wants to maybe try to do something. He's trying to offer compromises. But keep this in mind. When God calls you and he invites you, you have to come the direction that he calls. Remember, Jesus said that there will be people sitting at the wedding supper that do not have on the proper what? Wedding garment. So they're trying to be spiritual. They're trying to be godly, but they're not doing it with the right covering. They're not doing it with the invite that was given to them by the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So Pharaoh is trying to figure this out. He's trying to do things spiritually and acceptable to God, to this God that he recognized does have power. It seems to be greater than the gods that we serve. And I'm trying to understand this, and I'm trying to work with it. But what he's doing is trying to work with it while refusing to put down the gods that he served. He's refusing to remove himself from the Egyptian cultural norms and take on God. In other words, we got to sometimes decide in ourselves that I'm going to turn my back on the philosophies and the ideologies that I may have been either raised with, or they may be popular, or may be very attractive, and just believe God. And I say this almost every time we get together, that the scripture tries to make sure that we understand that if you're going to serve God, you're going to have to serve him, not by sight, but by what? But by faith. We walk by faith, not by sight. You got to believe God that he is. God says he's a spirit, and you must worship him in spirit and in truth. All right, so we're going to close with this, that one of the things that Pharaoh is not doing, Pharaoh's trying to understand and compromise with God. And that sounds like a very wonderful, beautiful human thing to do. I'm trying to work and compromise with God, but he's not kind of compromise. Number one, that's a human thing of agreement. That's kind of things that we do with one another. We're not dealing with a human in that aspect. We're dealing with the God of all the universe. The God that creates all things. The God that when there was nothing is still here. The God that doesn't need a cause to be caused. All right? So he is the individual that's going to show us what it is that we need. But we have to believe and trust. And that's not always simple to do, because we, in our own mind, we like to have tangible. Well, I want to walk by what I can see. We're looking for light. And unfortunately, what the Lord is saying to us is that way is not going to work. You can't come through the Egyptian wisdom. You can't come through the global and the worldly and the philosophy of your nation and of your culture. You got to come to me by the way I call you. And the way he calls us is through Jesus. And he says, if you don't have on the proper wedding garment, like Jesus told that story, he said to that individual that was there, he got there, he recognizes where he needed to be, but he didn't have the righteousness of Christ, what? On. He didn't have the proper wedding garment on. And Jesus said, well, you got to take him out, because he doesn't belong here. He's trying to be and act and associate with the things of God without actually having the things of God in him. And that's an important difference. All right, so we're going to stop there. Any comments or questions?